On January 30th, 1944, Anzio Beachhead, Italy. Inside a cold, concrete bunker on the German line, Oberleutnant Hoffman gripped his pencil like a man clinging to a lifeline. His knuckles, whitened as distant thunder, rolled in from the coast. Through the periscope, smoke and fire blurred the horizon. Then came the sound. A deep, unnatural roar that seemed to crawl through the earth rather than the air. In a single heartbeat, Bunker Louisa, a fortress of 4 feet of reinforced concrete, ceased to exist. One moment, it commanded the battlefield. The next, it was a crater rimmed with twisted steel and pulverized stone. The shockwave slammed through Hoffman's chest like a hammer. 32 men inside that bunker never even screamed. "Unmöglich," he whispered, voice caught between disbelief and terror. The pencil trembled as he wrote his report. His engineering manuals had promised him security, that no gun short of a railway monster could breach their fortifications. And yet, the Americans had just erased a position designed to withstand 210 shells with a single round from somewhere far beyond the horizon. The weapon that did this had a name few at the front had heard before that day: the M1 240 Howitzer. This was its first appearance in combat, and it struck like a god of war announcing itself. At precisely 14:30 hours, a single shell from the 697th Field Artillery Battalion crossed 13 miles of sky and hit with surgical precision. One shot, one bunker, gone. Hoffman stared at the empty space through the periscope for what felt like hours. He'd been trained to believe in steel, in concrete, in the mathematical safety of fortifications. But as dust drifted like ash over the ruins, he realized something horrifying. The rules had changed. In the trenches behind him, murmurs spread like smoke. German soldiers spoke in hushed tones, describing earthquake shells that made the ground itself feel like it would swallow them. Some refused to re-enter bunkers at all, preferring the mud to the illusion of safety. Command would later call it a localized setback. The men on the ground called it something else entirely. The day the bunkers died. The M1 240 Howitzer wasn't just another gun, it was an announcement: fixed defenses, once the backbone of German doctrine, were no longer untouchable. For months, their engineers had believed in the mathematics of survival. The Americans had introduced the mathematics of annihilation. As the sun set over Anzio, Hoffman finished his field notes. He underlined one line twice, pressing so hard the pencil snapped. No bunker is safe. Before it ever shattered concrete at Anzio, the M1 240 Howitzer began as a question on a drawing board in 1940. How do you break something built never to break? American ordnance engineers had studied European bunkers and reached a grim conclusion: their best gun, the 155 Long Tom, could bruise but not break German fortifications. So the army demanded the impossible: a mobile artillery piece powerful enough to crack 6 feet of reinforced concrete at 14 miles, accurate enough to hit a single bunker, and light enough to be hauled across Europe. The task fell to Watervliet Arsenal in New York, where machine oil, blueprints, and ambition fused into steel. What emerged was unlike anything the U.S. Army had fielded before. The barrel alone stretched 35 feet and weighed more than 10 tons. When the gun was in firing position, its total weight climbed past 64,000 pounds. A special 6-wheeled wagon was built just to move the barrel. A dedicated M2 crane traveled with every unit to assemble the weapon, its crew trained to choreograph the ritual of construction with machine-like precision. They had to dig a recoil pit, level the platform, hoist and align the barrel, fit the breech block, check the elevation gears, and secure the anchors. 8 hours of setup turned a pile of steel into something capable of reshaping the battlefield. And when it fired, it spoke in a voice the enemy could not ignore. In late 1942, the first 6 prototypes were completed. By 1944, the arsenal had ramped up to producing 13 guns a month, eventually delivering 315 units. Each cost as much as a dozen Sherman tanks. But they were built not to seize ground, but to erase what defended it. Every gun represented thousands of hands, machinists, welders, inspectors. Many of them were women, stepping into industrial roles that had once been closed to them. They forged and machined each component to thousandths of an inch. The bore was heat-treated, bored, proof-fired, and checked again. No other artillery piece in the American arsenal received such obsessive attention. When the first finished M1 stood on the proving ground, soldiers described it as a cannon built like a cathedral. Its presence was physical, massive, deliberate, absolute. What made it different was not just its size, but its intent. Unlike the monstrous German railway guns chained to their tracks, this weapon could move. It was born to hunt fortresses, not to wait for them. This wasn't just engineering. It was a statement: the United States would not build walls. It would build the means to tear them down. At Anzio, the first shot had been a warning. In the months that followed, it became a campaign. German engineers had spent years carving steel and concrete into the Italian hills, believing their bunkers would hold until the last man. The Allies answered with the slow, methodical rhythm of super-heavy artillery. On January 30th, 1944, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion opened fire in earnest. One shell obliterated an observation post perched on the Alburn Hills. The crater that replaced it became the shape of things to come. The M1's precision stunned both sides. Its 360-pound shells traveled over 13 miles with such accuracy that a single shot could erase a position that had taken months to build. Allied forward observers watched through binoculars as bunkers folded inward like they were made of paper. German prisoners later described the sensation as if the earth itself had turned against us. The numbers told a quiet, brutal truth: 2,847 rounds fired at Anzio. 67 bunkers engaged, 61 destroyed. German war diaries spoke of super-heavy shells and untenable positions. What they didn't record was the silence that followed every hit, the way entire units dissolved into fear before the infantry even advanced. But the real proof came at Monte Cassino. For months, the Gustav Line had resisted everything the Allies threw at it. Bombers leveled the ancient monastery, but the bunkers beneath it held. When the 240 Howitzers joined the assault in May 1944, that changed. Their fire fell with terrifying precision, cutting into the mountainside and gutting the strong points anchoring the line. In 3 days, they accomplished what weeks of bombing had failed to do. General Francis Tucker of the British Indian Division watched the bombardment and called it a hammer in the hands of a surgeon. Each round crushed a point the defenders had believed untouchable. Paratroopers, who had once laughed off conventional shelling, now abandoned their fortifications after the first impact. The Gustav Line's collapse wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological unraveling. Concrete that had once been a shield had become a tomb. By summer, the M1 had earned its reputation. It didn't just support attacks, it opened them where the gun pointed. Fortifications ceased to exist. The M1's strength wasn't only in the weight of its shells, it was in the mind behind the trigger. Unlike the chaos of First World War barrages, American fire missions in 1944 were calculated like clockwork. At the heart of this system was the Fire Direction Center, the quiet nerve hub that turned raw coordinates into devastation. Forward observers, crouched in shell-pocked fields miles ahead, carried SCR 610 radios and high-powered scopes. When they found a target, their voices crackled through the line to the FDC. There, trained crews translated map grids, wind readings, and meteorological data into firing solutions with cold precision. Within 4 minutes, a round could be screaming toward a bunker miles away. But accuracy alone wasn't the trick. It was timing. Time-on-target techniques allowed several batteries to fire at staggered intervals, ensuring all shells landed simultaneously. To the Germans, it felt like the sky itself collapsed in a single heartbeat. A bunker might receive 6 240 rounds in 2 seconds, each weighing more than a man, each capable of tearing reinforced concrete apart from the inside out. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hedkin explained it simply: "We don't blanket the ground, we select and erase." This was not the brute force of massed fire. It was a scalpel, aimed with mathematical precision. To German soldiers, there was no warning, no rolling thunder to signal what was coming, just silence, then annihilation. The psychological effect was immense. A fortress could be gone before its occupants even reached for their helmets. American artillery had evolved into something terrifyingly efficient. The Howitzers were the muscle. The FDC was the brain. July 1944. Normandy. The hedgerow country around Saint-Lô had become a labyrinth of German strongpoints. Every crossroad bristled with machine guns. Every slope hid a bunker. Allied air raids had pounded the area for days, yet many defenses stood untouched, hidden behind the folds of the land. That was when the 240 Howitzers of the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion rolled into position. On July 24th, the first salvo cracked the silence. 3 shells arced through the air and slammed into Hill 122, where the Germans had dug bunkers into reverse slopes, believing themselves immune to bombardment. When the dust lifted, the hillside was a gouged wound. The fortifications were gone. Survivors fled. Within hours, the 3rd Parachute Division, veterans who had fought at Cassino, began abandoning their defenses. One captured officer admitted, "We built bunkers to survive aircraft. We didn't build them to survive this." The Howitzers didn't fight battles. They erased the conditions that made battles possible. Their fire cleared the way for infantry who no longer had to bleed for every meter of ground. 2 months later, they climbed into the mountains of northern Italy. German engineers had spent a year fortifying the Gothic line, carving bunkers into ridges that overlooked the valleys below. To the defenders, the terrain was an ally. To the Americans, it was a firing solution. The 697th Field Artillery Battalion set up their howitzers in the valleys, elevating their barrels almost straight up. Shells disappeared into the clouds, then plunged vertically onto the reverse slopes. Fortifications designed to resist horizontal fire crumbled like sandcastles hit by a wave. Private Donald Matthews, who handled ammunition, wrote home, "The mountain shakes when we fire. The bunkers just vanish. It sets like dropping thunder from the sky." 5 days later, the Futa Pass, a linchpin of the Gothic line, fell. German war diaries recorded more casualties from collapsing bunkers than from direct combat. The message was clear: no height, no bunker, no fortress could keep the M1 at bay. Where bombers faltered and infantry bled, the 240 howitzer opened the way. September 1944. Ahead stretched the West Wall, 390 miles of concrete and steel, the pride of German defensive doctrine. It had been built over years, dug into the soil of the fatherland like a promise. Here the enemy will break. The Americans brought the men 240 Howitzers to prove that promise wrong. The Siegfried Line's bunkers were thicker, deeper, and better armed than anything in Italy. Walls 3 to 8 feet thick, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, command posts buried under tons of reinforced concrete. It didn't matter. On October 8th, the 265th Field Artillery Battalion began its work. In 6 hours, they fired 238 rounds and destroyed 19 of 22 bunkers along the Scharnhorst line. Forward observers watched concrete peel away like wet plaster. Corporal Robert Williams of the 16th Infantry Regiment called it a series of earthquakes that didn't stop. The effect rippled across the front. The 278th Battalion tore through positions in the Schnee-Eifel region. The 698th encircled Metz, smashing its fortress ring in 2 relentless weeks of bombardment. At Strasbourg, a single 90-minute barrage reduced a dozen bunkers to rubble. German soldiers who had trained for years to fight from behind concrete suddenly faced a weapon that ignored every layer of their defenses. The psychological collapse was as devastating as the physical damage. Captured reports admitted that super-heavy American artillery renders fixed fortifications untenable. This wasn't a single decisive battle. It was systematic dismantling. Every bunker identified, calculated, and erased. The Siegfried Line, once thought unbreakable, cracked under mathematical precision and industrial weight. The MN1 didn't storm the wall. It deleted it. Behind the roar of the Howitzer was a science as precise as the gun itself. The M17 concrete-piercing shell weighed 360 pounds and hit at over 2,300 feet per second. Its hardened steel cap punched through up to 6 feet of reinforced concrete before a delayed fuse detonated deep inside. The result wasn't just a blast. It was sympathetic fracturing. Shock waves ricocheted through steel reinforcements, cracking entire structures from within. A bunker that might have survived 100 smaller shells simply imploded after one well-placed hit. The high-explosive M114 round carried 49 pounds of TNT enhanced with aluminum powder, amplifying its blast by 40%. Fired for surface bursts, it left craters wide enough to swallow trucks and deep enough to bury defenses. Where concrete met one fire, nothing remained intact. But power alone wasn't victory. Logistics made it possible. Each howitzer consumed 50 to 100 shells daily, 18 to 36 tons of ammunition. The supply chain stretched thousands of miles from Watervliet to the front. Liberty ships carried the rounds as deck cargo. Red Ball Express convoys hauled them over war-torn roads on reinforced trucks built specifically to bear their weight. Every shell was the product of microscopic tolerances, machined to within 1/100th of an inch, inspected individually, filled, sealed, and proof-tested. By March 1945, American depots held 500,000 rounds, a stockpile no Axis nation could hope to match. Monthly consumption peaked at 35,000 shells during the Rhine crossings. The Germans built fortresses. The Americans built the means to erase them faster than they could be rebuilt. That was the real advantage. Not just a bigger gun, but an entire war machine calibrated to feed it. For all its power, the M1 was not a machine that operated itself. Every blast that shattered concrete began with sweat, precision, and discipline from a crew of 14. The chief of section commanded the piece. The gunner aligned the barrel with surgical accuracy. Ammunition handlers guided the 360-pound shell with the M2 crane, while powdermen loaded up to 8 propellant bags behind it. Drivers, riggers, and sentries kept the weapon alive and ready to move. Loading was a coordinated dance: hoist, slide, ram, lock. 90 seconds of flawless teamwork turned a silent steel barrel into a thunderclap. Firing was brutal on the body. The recoil shook the earth, even with protection. Concussive force slammed into their chests with each shot. Crews rotated positions to keep exhaustion at bay. After 10 rounds, Private Michael Sullivan recalled, "Your arms feel like lead, but when you know what those shells are doing up front, you don't slow down." Forward observers lived even closer to danger. Perched with infantry, often beyond the safety of their own lines, they guided fire with radios and plotting boards. A few spoken numbers could decide the fate of a fortress miles away. Lieutenant Robert Anderson of the 265th survived 187 days in combat and called in the destruction of 47 bunkers. It felt he said years later, like summoning a storm, one call, and a bunker was just gone. They saw the war differently. Through their scopes, they watched German soldiers flee before the shells struck. They saw the wounded stumble from shattered entrances. They carried those images long after the guns went silent. The M1 was a masterpiece of steel, but its true precision came from the hands and minds of the men who served it. For German soldiers, the arrival of the 240 Howitzer marked the moment when concrete stopped meaning safety. Their doctrine had been built on faith in fortifications. Every wall, every bunker, was supposed to be a shield against the chaos of modern war. But when the first super-heavy shells struck, faith cracked as easily as concrete. Reports captured after battles spoke in cold, frightened language, positions untenable, single shells causing disproportionate losses. Bunkers that had withstood years of smaller barrages vanished in seconds. A war diary from the 7th Army noted, morale effect catastrophic. Troops refused to occupy forward positions. Men who had once laughed at artillery dugouts now begged not to be assigned to bunkers targeted by American observers. Veterans who had endured years on the Eastern Front against Soviet mass fire admitted they had never experienced anything like this because the American shell didn't carpet the earth. It chose one point and obliterated it. Some soldiers panicked at the sound alone. Others deserted before the first round landed, and some, facing the inevitable, simply stayed silent, waiting for a shell they couldn't stop. The German 19th Army reported that more than half its casualties in some sectors came from artillery, with the 240 responsible for a disproportionate share. What made it worse was the helplessness. No counter-battery fire could reliably reach the MM-1's positions. No maneuver could outpace its range. Heinrich Simon, a regimental commander, said years later, regular shells we could survive, but when those monster rounds came, even the bravest men felt like ants under a hammer. The day the Americans brought precision to heavy artillery was the day German faith in concrete died. The 240 Howitzer was never meant to be a symbol. Yet, as the war ground on, it became exactly that. Unlike the colossal German railway guns, which required weeks of construction and entire battalions to fire a single round, the M1 was designed to move. It could be broken down, holed by standard prime movers, reassembled in the mud, and made ready to fire in less than a day. It didn't need spectacle. It needed only a target. That was the essence of American war industry: mobility, precision, and overwhelming supply. While Germany poured resources into rare, dramatic superweapons, the United States built hundreds of practical giants that could travel anywhere, support anyone, and strike anything. The M1 wasn't a tool of terror. It was a tool of methodical dismantling, a democratic weapon. Not in ideology, but in scale. Any division with the logistics to support it could bring fortress-breaking fire to the front. There was no mystery, no cult of secrecy, no single prototype to protect. Just steel, training, and a convoy. At the front, its presence was quiet. No parades, no mythic names like Dora or Gustav. But when it spoke, fortresses that had taken years to build were gone in minutes. It reflected a different kind of power, not mystical, not theatrical, but industrial and absolute. In the ruins of Metz, a captured German officer summed it up in a single line: "You built a weapon for soldiers, not for museums." By the winter of 1945, the Germans had one last illusion left, that their great cities and fortress networks could delay the inevitable. Nuremberg, Wessel, Saarbrücken, each had been fortified with underground bunkers, interlocking defenses, and thick-walled command posts. But they were no longer safe. When the 240 Howitzers rolled into range, entire sections of those fortifications disappeared overnight. Observation posts that had been meticulously camouflaged were found, plotted, and struck with surgical accuracy. A single salvo could erase a strongpoint that thousands of men were meant to defend. At Nuremberg, after 90 minutes of bombardment, Allied infantry advanced into a shattered perimeter without meeting a single surviving bunker. Prisoners spoke of feeling as if the earth opened and swallowed us. The once feared fortress cities were not defeated in long, bloody sieges. They were unmade in hours. Even the Reich's most elaborate defense belts could not outlast a weapon built to break the unbreakable. The age of static fortification ended not with fanfare, but with a thunderclap. No line of concrete, no wall, no bunker remained invincible. The M1 240 Howitzer had turned fortresses from symbols of strength into tombstones. The German commanders understood numbers, and numbers terrified them. They could count the shells fired, the bunkers lost, the cities cracked open, but what broke them wasn't just the arithmetic, it was the certainty. The 240 Howitzer didn't just hit hard, it hit without pause. For every bunker destroyed, there were a dozen shells behind it, already rolling forward through a supply chain that never seemed to end. While German factories struggled under bombing raids, America kept building. Every truck that arrived at the front carried more proof of inevitability. Field Marshal Hasso von Manteuffel would later admit, "We could fight generals, we could outmaneuver divisions, but we couldn't outlast that gun." German tactics evolved in desperation. Camouflage, decoys, dispersal. Orders even advised abandoning fixed bunkers entirely when super-heavy artillery was detected. It was a quiet admission of defeat, a reversal of doctrine carved into decades of military tradition. The sound of a 240 round arriving was unmistakable, a low, rolling concussion that seemed to vibrate inside bone. German soldiers described it as the sound of the end, not because it killed them all, but because it told them resistance wouldn't matter. Every shell was an industrial promise. This will not stop. For the men who operated the 240 Howitzer, victory carried its own scars. They were not distant strategists. They were close enough to feel the earth buck when the gun spoke, close enough to see the walls crumble, to know that every thunderous impact meant lives erased. The crews were athletes of war, working in perfect rhythm. 14 men to one gun, each movement rehearsed until it was instinct. The shell swung from the M2 crane like a pendulum, the loader's gloved hands guiding it home, the gunner setting angles with a practiced touch. 90 seconds from lift to fire. A seamless dance of muscle, steel, and pressure. But power came with a price. The blast was punishing. Even with ear protection, most crewmen left the war partially deaf. Forward observers carried heavier burdens. They saw the shell land. They watched German soldiers flee, fall, or vanish into collapsing bunkers. Many spoke of dreams that followed them home. Dreams of coordinates whispered into a radio and silence after. And yet, they never doubted the purpose. Every round fired meant fewer men storming fortresses with rifles and bayonets. The gun didn't just destroy, it saved lives on the ground. They carried the weight of their work with quiet pride and quiet pain. Captured German documents from late 1944 read like the autopsy reports of a dying doctrine. Officers described men refusing to occupy bunkers, companies breaking apart before battle began. Words like demoralization and psychological collapse appeared again and again. The Wehrmacht had trained for artillery barrages, but this was different. Traditional bombardments were storms, terrifying but survivable. The 240 Howitzer was something colder, precise, methodical. A single round could erase a position meant to hold for weeks. Veterans recalled how panic spread faster than shrapnel. Soldiers would listen for the distant report, the heavy, delayed thunderclap that signaled a round on its way, and many would simply abandon their posts. Some officers described finding empty bunkers after impacts, the men scattered, their faith in the concrete around them shattered. One German major, Interrogated after the fall of Metz, said it plainly, "We were not fighting men, we were fighting an earthquake that knew our coordinates." Surrender was no longer shameful. It was logical. Against a weapon that turned fortresses into open graves, fighting seemed pointless. Even elite units, men who had once stood unshaken at Monte Cassino, began to yield before the gun ever fired its second round. The true power of the 240 Howitzer was forged not on the battlefield, but in the roaring furnaces and precision workshops of America. Waterlight Arsenal, an unassuming name that became a cornerstone of modern artillery, turned raw steel into fortress killers with relentless precision. Each barrel required 65 tons of alloyed steel, days of boring and heat treatment, and hundreds of machining steps. The steel was measured to fractions of an inch. Each shell, weighing 360 pounds, was crafted with a level of consistency that allowed crews to fire with near mathematical certainty. Unlike Germany's giant experimental cannons, the M1 wasn't a spectacle. It was mass-produced excellence. By 1944, production lines delivered 13 guns per month. American industry didn't worship its machines, it multiplied them. Behind every shell fired at Anzio or Metz was a network of shipyards, factories, rail lines, and convoys. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic with their decks stacked high with 240 ammunition. Trucks of the Red Ball Express rumbled through the night, carrying shells and powder to the front. The howitzer was not just a weapon, it was the front edge of an entire nation's labor. The hand that pulled the lanyard at the front was backed by thousands of unseen hands that forged, welded, and hulled. This was industry turned into firepower. March 1945. The Rhine crossings. Germany's final shield. Along its eastern banks stood reinforced bunkers, command posts, and gun nests built to withstand anything short of annihilation. That annihilation arrived on the backs of 12 240 howitzers. The bombardment began at dusk. Over the river, the thunder rolled like distant tectonic shifts, each impact peeling away layers of German defenses. Bunkers that had been years in the making vanished in minutes. By midnight, the Wessel defenses, once thought impenetrable, were broken open like brittle shells. German officers spoke later of the feeling helplessness in slow motion. They watched their strong points collapse one by one, unable to fire back at guns they couldn't even see. The fortifications were supposed to buy time. Instead, they marked the place where their army's will to resist crumbled. Within 24 hours, Allied infantry crossed the Rhine with minimal opposition. The Germans who survived the bombardment were in no condition to fight. Many walked out of their shattered positions with hands raised. The last great barrier of the Reich had fallen, not through blood-soaked trench fighting, but through precision and overwhelming force. The thunder over Wessel was the sound of walls giving up. The war ended, but the thunder of the 240 howitzer never truly fell silent. It lingered, in broken concrete, in memory, in the way the world thought about war itself. Before the weapon's arrival, fortresses had been symbols of permanence. Concrete walls promised safety, promised that courage and engineering could hold back armies. The howitzer ended that illusion. It proved that no wall was sacred, no bunker immortal. Its power didn't just lie in its shell weight or range, it was the fusion of industry, precision, and logistics. For every gun at the front, thousands of workers at home forged the steel, machined the barrel, filled the shells. It was democracy's arsenal made tangible, a weapon born from factory floors, not palaces. The Germans had believed their concrete lines could stall the inevitable. Instead, they became monuments to a vanished doctrine. From Anzio to the Siegfried Line, from Wessel to Nuremberg, the M1 howitzer erased fortifications faster than they could be rebuilt. It didn't just destroy positions, it destroyed faith in fortifications themselves. Yet victory carried shadows. For the American crews, Each round meant lives erased beyond the horizon. For the German defenders, each detonation tore away another layer of morale until only surrender remained. For both, the sound of those guns would echo for years in dreams and memories. After 1945, nations remembered. Engineers redesigned defense doctrines. Armies built mobility, not walls. Precision became the new king of warfare. The Howitzer's legacy lived on in Cold War artillery, in guided munitions, in every weapon designed to strike swiftly and leave nothing standing. A single weapon, mass-produced and methodically employed, had rewritten the rules of war. And so, when the last shell was fired and the crews rolled their guns home, the world they left behind was not the same. Fortresses were no longer unbreakable. Battles were no longer defined by how long walls could hold. The thunder of the 240 howitzer had spoken, and the world had listened. The age of fortresses had ended. The age of precision had begun.